Alrighty, everyone. We might kick off. The wonderful Electric Peach team are going to stick around in the background and let people in as they join the lobby. But for those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting either online in a webinar before or either in person, my name's Shaun and I'm the manager of cybersecurity at Evernimble. Evernimble is a managed service provider and a managed security service provider based out of WA with offices all over Australia. And we primarily focus on providing IT services and cybersecurity services to small, medium business, which is really, really important given the topic of today's discussion. With me today, I have Ryan Ettridge, who is the Chief Growth Officer out at the amazing CyberCert team. Ryan is a cybersecurity leader, entrepreneur, and transformational expert who's dedicated to removing barriers for leaders within their organizations, enabling them to make a fearless, authentic impact on the real world. Ryan's a former member of PwC, and he scaled the firm's cybersecurity business over 30 times in 7 years, which is amazing. He's had experience advising governments, enterprises, and critical infrastructure on cyber risk compliance and resilience. However, now is focused in the wonderful small, medium business space with the amazing SMB1001 framework, which is kind of our topic today. So welcome, Ryan, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Shaun. Thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone who's joining. I'm looking forward to the questions and the conversation that comes from this. So pleasure to be here.
Pleasure having you. Look, SMB1001 is a sort of topic and a title and subject that Evernimble's been throwing around on social media and to our clients for a while now, for the last sort of 6 months. And we've got a range of audience members with us today. So I think we should start off with a pretty simple question, I hope, which is, what is SMB1001 and what does it actually cover for our small, medium business teams?
Nice. Well, so most folks, either SMB leaders or staff, and certainly we would hope most security and technical experts would be familiar with ISO. That's either 9001 or, quality assurance standards. So ISO's been around as a standards body for many, many years, decades. And their focus has been on helping organizations of all sizes, but really in the cyberspace, they've been focused on enterprises and lots of governments across the world, including large, state governments, federal governments, and even large enterprises have adopted in some fashion the ISO 27000 standard. Yeah. And there's other ones like NIST you might have heard of, and Essential 8 is another one. All of these standards have been designed primarily to close the cybersecurity risk gap for the larger end of town. So, and quite necessarily so, because enterprises and large organizations have been the focus of regulators and legislation for a long time because of the impact that they have on the economy and their supplies and so on. But there hasn't ever been a standard for small businesses that helps them focus on what's important to them from a cybersecurity perspective. And so ISO and government standards have then attempted to be shortened and then given to the small business to work out how they can go and solve the cybersecurity challenge themselves. So that's not a bad idea, except we know that small businesses' priorities are running their business, often trying to pay the staff and keep the business lights on, depending on what stage the small business is at, right? But it's not their skill set, desire, or even priority to try and work out what some of the larger security standards and government standards mean. So SMB 1001 is the specific small business cybersecurity standard specifically designed for small businesses, with the idea of there's an ecosystem of partners that understand that standard, like Evernimble, that can help the SMB interpret it, meet the standard that's practical and proportionate for them, and actually get a certification once they've demonstrated that they can achieve what's in that standard. So like ISO, you can certify against ISO, but small businesses, that's way overkill. To try and attempt to butcher ISO into a small business is just it's like sledgehammer smashing a fly, right? Sometimes you might hit the fly, but you'll break everything else along the way. Yeah. So SMB 1001 is a certifiable standard specifically designed for small businesses.
Yeah, awesome. I think it's really topical when we talk about ISO, or even I think Essential 8 for a lot of our audience members who are in the room. You know, being an Australian, or Essential 8 is obviously kind of one of the main key ones that are talked about within the country, because it's, you know, it comes from the Australian Signals Directorate and the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. How does SMB 1001 kind of compare to Essential 8, and sort of what are its strengths when you sort of look at that framework compared to what SMB 1001 can provide for businesses?
Yeah, it's a really common question that we get, because it's often sounds like, because it's the Essential 8 and it's shortened, that it should be easy for small businesses. But actually, it was designed for enterprises. It was designed fundamentally as the foundations that every enterprise should have as essential. The 8 controls, and then it was 32 or 34 at one point, and then some top 4 and some others. And so the difference, let's say, A, SMB 1001 is designed with the SMB in mind. Yeah. B, SMB 1001 is certifiable. Essential 8 is not. So even when you demonstrate to some extent that you've achieved the Essential 8 controls, and you get a qualified assessor to come and help you assure that you've hit the maturity levels in Essential 8, you actually have to do that each time, because there's no certificate you can use once and then show to many. So that's that thing. Now, small businesses have a business to run, and the Essential 8 technical controls don't actually guide the small business to do some of the other things that are important to protect against cyber risks. An example is fraud policy. Essential 8 doesn't talk about that. Essential 8 doesn't specifically talk about an information security policy, or an asset register, or a visitor register. All of these types of controls are really applicable to small businesses. So SMB 1001 designed with the small business process and operations in mind. It's dynamic as well. So can you tell me the last time Essential 8 was updated?
Oh, I mean, if we're going technically it was in 2022.
Right. Yeah.
But I have thoughts and opinions on that as well, given that you know, it's such a relatively modern update. Didn't really change too much, other than, you know, making it a little bit more difficult for small medium business, really.
Right. Yeah. And again, not designed for the small medium business. So in that case, the updates from government and even ISO as an enterprise standard are 5, 6, 7 years. Now, if a small business doesn't have the cybersecurity expertise, which often they don't, then how do they know what's relevant to them today? So SMB 1001 is developed by Dynamic Standards International, or DSI. The D is dynamic, and the dynamic nature of SMB 1001, it's updated annually. So the feedback that comes from the network, from Nimble, from the consultants that advise on SMB 1001 implementation will feed that back. Hey, what are we doing for AI? What are we doing for, what's this multi-factor authentication, and how does it apply here? All of that feedback is actually gathered through the DSI steering committee, and then it's considered for an update in the next release, of course, which will be 2026. So yeah, I think that kind of covers the main differences between Essential 8.
And I think that part, for me, as someone who's been in sort of that advisory space to businesses from a cybersecurity perspective, and even an IT perspective for the last, you know, 5 or 6 years, I think the key difference around the SMB 1001 framework being updated regularly compared to Essential 8, which, you know, had an update in 2022, and then even ISO, I mean, I think it was 2013 to 2022 was the 2 major updates. Like, that's a long time. That's 9 years or 10 years. And we talk all the time about how quickly technology changes and shifts. Like, imagine how much multi-factor authentication would have adapted between 2013 to that time and to when the standards were updated, and how much that shifts. It's shifts so quickly. So it's really refreshing to hear that SMB 1001 has been reviewed sort of annually and updated in line with what's sort of industry best practice and what we're seeing also in the threat landscape perspective from what's coming in and targeting small medium business. To our audience members, please feel free to fire off your questions. Now that you sort of have a bit of an understanding of what SMB 1001 is, we want to hear what you all want to hear from us. So please chuck your questions into the Q&A section within Teams. We'll endeavor to sort of answer them on the fly as we go through. Otherwise, I'm sure we'll have some time at the end as well where we can sort of review those questions and come back to them too. Look, Ryan, not dissimilar, if we go back to Essential 8, not dissimilar to Essential 8 that has 3 maturity levels. SMB 1001 also has what you could consider maturity levels to help businesses sort of scaffold their cyber maturity and implement them. Can you give our audience a bit of insight as to what those 5 levels are and how that supports them in their journey to become cyber mature?
Yeah, nice. Great question. So there's 5 tiers in SMB 1001. Yeah, and tier 1. So when we talk about SMBs, and let's say there's 2 million-ish in Australia, there's 32 million in the US, and across Asia Pac, there's 80 million small businesses. And they're not all the same size, obviously, right? In fact, the definition, if we take the American definition, is up to 100 million US annual turnover, right? Now, that could be 10 people, that could be 100 seats, or it could be a really successful SaaS business that actually has a small core team, right? So when designing and thinking about cybersecurity for small businesses in Australia and globally, because it is an international standard, it's anyone from the flower shop owner to the butcher, to the 10-person accounting advisory firm, to the 100-seat technology MSP, and so on. And so the SMB 1001 standard is designed for a small business, depending on their context and profile and where they are in their cyber journey, to decide what is the most appropriate fit for purpose to start their maturity journey, because security is this continuing process, right? It's not a one-time thing, hence the dynamic. Now, the other cool thing is each of the tiers have been designed to address specific types of impacts or outcomes that can be mitigated if you have the controls in place at that tier. Example is Gold is tier 3 in SMB 1001. That's the certification that businesses would receive if they've implemented the 23 controls that are in Gold. Fundamental controls, simple, fit for purpose for the SMB. That's designed for managing the risks associated with personal and sensitive information, right? Because in Gold, we've got information security policies, awareness training, incident response processes. So if there's a breach, you actually adhere to the APP Privacy Principle 11 and the notifiable breach reporting, right? So if you have Silver, you're not actually required in the SMB 1001 standard to have incident response in place. So, but not everyone is going to deal with personal information. So not everyone needs to be Gold. There might be Bob's Burgers in the Western Australian region, right? That doesn't actually take any personal information, but Bob's job is to make sure that his and his team's burgers are delicious and, of course, delivered to the people when they ask them. And so the systems, in that case, bronze might be okay for Bob, silver might be okay for Bob. Silver also pre-qualifies SMBs for cyber insurance now. And so that's a real bonus that makes it easy and frictionless for SMBs to receive a policy offer from those that respect them. So that's the idea behind the maturity levels. Meet the SMB where they're at, guide them along the growth journey, and make it easy for partners to help the SMB pick the right one based on that selector tool and that categorization process.
Yeah, awesome. I think it really gives them that that ability to sort of, you mentioned earlier how, you know, for small medium business, they don't necessarily have cybersecurity experts in the room with them that are on, you know, their payroll. They don't have IT managers all the time as well. So how does the framework sort of support them in and how do MSPs like Evernimble and other IT partners sort of support them in that journey as a result of using that framework?
Yeah, it is designed, so it is ecosystem centric by design. Control number one in SMB 1001 from bronze through to diamond is that you must have a technical support specialist. That's number one. That is the control actually built into the standard. And so it is designed to distribute across the skills that exist in the market. Now, that can be an internal person if you've got a qualified cybersecurity and technical support specialist. It can, for the bronze people, it can be the brother that has the cybersecurity or sister that has the cybersecurity qualifications that can guide. So my wife is a pediatric speech therapist, for example. Yes, she deals with personal information and so on, but I can guide her on that. She doesn't need to go and find an MSP to help her get to silver or gold because there's someone within the household that can guide them there. So it is designed not expecting the SMB to have a CISO because even the large organizations can't keep their CISOs. So how the heck are we going to be able to attract and retain CISOs within small businesses?
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? And I think that's probably one of the key things is like you look at Essential 8 or you look at NIST or you look at ISO and it's like these massive controls that are, sort of overwhelming. And even in SMB 1001, as you kind of get up to that higher tier in Platinum and Diamond, those controls are still there. But the fact that it's the first thing the framework mentions is, hey, you need someone who can help you understand this, and whether that's internal or external is actually really important because it shouldn't be, the sole trader or even the single partner who's never looked at IT or cybersecurity before, trying to implement a framework and keep themselves secure in this day and age with all the rising cybersecurity attacks and cybercrime.
And it's like your accounting partners and your insurance advisors and others. They exist to help you make that decision. It's not expected that you are an accountant just because you're running a small business. In the same way, you're not expected, nor probably would you ever want to understand cybersecurity to the extent that you can run your own cybersecurity operation. But having said that, you still have an obligation to use the cybersecurity technologies. You can't completely discharge your accountability when it comes to cyber risk as a business owner.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Ryan, I think there was an article released yesterday or a few weeks, maybe in the last few weeks, that talked about cybercrime in Australia being up, or cybersecurity incidents, I suppose, being up 25% in the last year. And in the last 6 months alone, we've had over 600 data breaches. Now, look, some of those hit mainstream media, like we see the big ones, the really big ones that hit mainstream media. We've had obviously a recent scare with banks throughout Australia, but obviously the small, medium business ones don't attract enough media attention for us to hear about every single one of them. How does any cybersecurity framework help businesses sort of reduce their risk in that space? And specifically, obviously, since we're talking about it, how does SMB 1001 fit into that space around, sort of reducing that risk? Specifically, I want to look at and talk about how SMB 1001 does that both from a people perspective, a policy perspective, but then also from a technical control perspective too.
Nice, yeah. So the balance that you've just touched on is really important. It's not let's say the Essential 8, for example. So just to be really clear, SMB 1001 is not intended to replace or compete with others. It's to fill the gaps. If you can imagine all the other standards are the big rocks in the glass jar, then SMB 1001 is the sand that fills all the gaps and connects them. And yes, it can be instead of if the other ones aren't appropriate. But the idea is you pick it up when all of the other ones aren't appropriate because they're very good, but they're not designed for the SMB. So it does have to have a balance of your people, processes, and technology controls. And I want to introduce an idea that has fundamentally been the crux of my cybersecurity training for 20 years, right? Cybersecurity has no intrinsic value. It's like the padlock. The padlock has no intrinsic value. It's $5 from Bunnings until you attach it to a really important asset. And then you go, oh, that padlock's now worth $50 because whatever the things inside of it is protecting, we want to make sure that the padlock is fit for purpose, yeah? So if you can imagine information and systems that help the business run are the assets for the SMB, then of course the risk of them being compromised, like let's say it's personal information and being breached, when personal information is taken and it's on the dark web, it ain't coming back. I don't care what anyone says. Even if you pay for the decryption keys, it's still gone. And because it's personal and health and other sensitive information, it's not that easy to change your identity and health information and then pretend like that never happened. So that's one of the impacts, and that's what the Australian privacy principles and all the other global privacy principles are intended to protect. The idea is that with that, you have considered that that information is important not just to you as the business to process it, but of course to the owner of that information. And so cybersecurity has to be designed proportionate to the risk within which you're operating. So one size does not fit all for cybersecurity. The risk is not one size fits all. The assets are not as valuable as all of the other assets. So for a small business, it can be assumed, however, that there are some fairly common cyber threats to breaching those information assets and digital systems. And that's the way most of the fundamental cybersecurity controls for small business are designed. It doesn't matter to me so much what exactly the type of information is that you operate. But if it's really important, I do know how I would break in. And therefore, I do know what sort of padlock I would want not to see if I'm going to break in. When you don't have the padlock, that equals a vulnerability. Yeah, it means that there's a hole in your system that I don't need my crowbar to come in and smash that. I'm just going to walk in and open the chest up and steal the asset and walk away. So in a roundabout way of answering that question, the blend of the controls that are designed in SMB1001 and generally in most of the other cool standards that are really well known and adopted, it's designed based on the common threats to breaking the assets, assuming the common vulnerabilities exist in your environment.
Yeah. Awesome.
Paraphrase that somehow with your AI recording things, and then you can do an ebook on that thing.
Yeah, we'll get AI to re-quote you on that and somehow sort of sum that up. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. That's actually a really interesting analogy you started off with that I've never really heard before, but it makes complete sense, right? Like we don't go, you might have something surrounded by a fence that's worth thousands of dollars, but then we go and protect it with a $10 or $20 padlock from Bunnings, and all of a sudden that $10 or $20 spent is actually worth more to us because we're protecting something with it. And it's really interesting, right? So we see, sometimes, and there's a question in one of the chats around this too, but we see, I see on a day-to-day with my job going and trying to convince businesses that cybersecurity is something to take seriously. Around protecting their assets or protecting their environment, their data, or their value that they're providing to their clients, whatever it might be. And they'll go and they'll put a lock on the front door, but then they won't lock their windows. And they'll leave their windows wide open, or they'll go and put a fence around the front half of their property, all right, but not secure the back half of their property. And so then it's so easy for someone to just walk in, because they haven't, they've probably gone and looked at, the unfortunate part of these things hitting mainstream media is they look at what targeted Optus or what targeted Medibank or what targeted Latitude or whatever it is, right? That's not what's targeting small medium business in Australia, and so. That's where I think it's really important that, as you said, the role in this framework is get someone who understands cybersecurity and what's going on.
Nice.
Because they're the subject matter expert. You don't go and hire someone who's never had anything to do with accounting to come in and do your books in your business.
True.
So why try and do that with cyber and IT as well?
Yeah, and. Great point. There's a concept for those on the call that's called defense in depth, right? It's another pretty common cybersecurity term, and that's to say, yes, you've got a padlock on your front gate, but if you can jump the fence, you definitely want to make sure that your front door's locked, and then when you get in, you want to make sure it's got an alarm and a camera system and all these other deterrents, and some of those are preventions, and some of those then, of course, you call 000 as the response to that break in and try and recover whatever it is that's been stolen or broken or whatever that thing is. And so the approach is the same for a small business. And there is no one size fits all. It depends on the type of industry that organization may be in. So let's say financial services versus mining versus something else. There might be a better technology bundle that suits the accountancy firm versus the mining firm. Operational technology, right? So OT environments, they're just not the same as your traditional corporate systems. And so someone like you guys have to help the SMB work through, here's what we know works for that type organization to protect equivalent and proportionately the risk that you're exposed to. Not too much and not too little.
I think that's really that's really good insight. Ryan, I want to talk about certification because we've talked about how SMB 1001 you can certify in that. Really cool thing because we can't do that with some of the other certifications, right? What does certification look like for SMB 1001 for our team? Specifically, we've probably got a lot of people on the call with us today who are perhaps reporting to boards or to executive team members. And we know that boards, when they're having these kinds of conversations, really want a high level sort of overview or a high level tick box in some degree, right? That, hey, yeah, we're doing good things in cybersecurity and IT. How does the certification process for SMB 1001 support them in sort of having that conversation with their board? And what does that look like for them?
Nice. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about the recognition of the certification. So the idea with certification is you don't need to answer the questions more than once. You really just show the certification that confirms that the controls in SMB 1001 have been done. Does it matter to the recipient what that means? Yes, it does. So depending on who you're giving that certification to, it has to have value. We'll take insurers, for example. Insurers recognize CyberCert and SMB 1001 certification to say that if you give us your silver or your gold, we know what controls are in them. So we know that you don't need to answer the 23 questions. We actually know that you've done the 23 controls and it's director attested. Yeah. So up to gold, CyberCert is self-attested, not self-assessed, self-attested with the help of your MSP or partner to ensure that you've done that. Platinum and Diamond, the two top tiers, are independently verified. So they're like mini external audits that are designed to independently verify that the controls have been done, as well as the MSP who's certified to help the SMB get there. Now, for boards sometimes they just trust a certification, but they need to know what the certification means. And I've presented to 1,000 boards. Actually, they want to know what questions are being answered. Yeah. That the questions that they have are being answered confidently. Yeah. And so it's important for boards to say, to tell them, really answer their questions. You can show them the CyberCert as verification, but you actually need to help them understand what you're protecting, how it's protected, and to what extent it's actually been verified. And that's where the cyber certification really helps validate that, because CyberCert is a relatively new certification in the industry. ISO is fairly familiar, others are fairly familiar. So what we're doing in parallel is, of course, seeking the government endorsement for SMB 1001 certification and the recognition of CyberCert in supply chains as recommendation through the ACSC, so that this is actually some really recognized and deliberate guidance. Until such time, you do have to do a little bit of explaining to the board to say, actually, this is what it means. And then when they understand that, and of course, in board language, the certification actually really has some weight. It's recognized by the lead consulting firms in Australia. It's recognized by the lead insurers in Australia and internationally as well. And it's increasingly recognized by the key brands that are regulated. SOCI, AES, CSF, privacy, PCI, increasing. So we'll have some announcements in the next couple of weeks of the big logos that have said, hey, we now accept SMB 1001 certification for our SMB suppliers. Finally, how good is that? You don't need to answer the ISO questions anymore.
No, and it's, I feel like for those people on the call, whoever had to answer an insurance questionnaire or anything like that to do with their cybersecurity, they're going to love being able to check that box at the beginning that says, yes, we've got an SMB 1001 certification. And no, I don't have to answer the next 4 pages of questions to attest that as a result of already having that certification in place. So that's really awesome news and great to hear that it's sort of growing and gaining that popularity, but also that sort of acknowledgement and recognition.
Yeah. It is very.
How long does the certification last for?
Yeah, so because the standard is dynamic, updated annually, the certification lasts for 12 months once within the year. that you've actually certified. So let's say you certify, or you would achieve your certification in August. It lasts you for 12 months. Next year, there'll be a new standard. Of course, that's what you'll be assessed against and certify against when you're ready to renew that certification. So it is that simple. And AI, let's say AI takes off this year. We know it is. It already is. So there has to be something, at least guidance for SMBs in the cyberspace to say, what should I do? So if we wait 6 years, the SMB dies.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that in mind, Ryan, I guess probably one of the worries that might be in some of our audience head around it sort of changing every year is how much of a sort of upkeep, how much resourcing do we need to throw behind this to maintain our certification? Like, are we expecting massive changes to controls and outcomes that are required as a result of it being reviewed every year? Or is it sort of a bit more of a maintenance approach where there might be tweaks to language and an introduction of maybe 1 or 2 additional controls?
It's hard to say. And so Dynamic Standards International is overseen by 25 industry experts and SMB representatives on the steering committee. And the process is, as the feedback comes through, as those experts are noticing what's working for SMBs and not, that actually gets tabled and discussed quarterly in preparation for the final meeting that happens in September and then released within that next quarter for the next year. Now, one of the key principles of SMB 1001 is the SMB, right? So it can't be to the extent that this new thing is going to revolutionize the approach unless it's absolutely necessary. And then even still, you've got to give enough notice and whatever else for the, not just the SMB, it's actually the partner ecosystem that has to transition the SMB. The SMB is unlikely, unless they have the expertise, to interpret what that change means. So the standard is designed to filter through the ecosystem. We have 250 partners in Australia and New Zealand at the moment that can support SMBs, and there's actually soon to be a couple of thousand in the country and 40,000 globally with the new PAX8 partnership announcement that we have. Now, that's how we scale this thing. That's how we help the SMB with the likes of you guys to translate that to say, look, now here's one other thing on that. We have some really strong alignment with the big technology vendors. That means that their product portfolio reviews the standard as well and says, if this is the thing that's coming with the right early indicators, then they release the new thing within their product portfolio. So it's not like we would introduce something that's not available to an SMB because we've broken the very problem we're trying to solve in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really good that there's that ecosystem of both SMB advising sort of the steering committee or being part of that steering committee and advising the sort of maturity of this framework, but then also the products and how that supports the technology change and support behind it as well. Look, we're nearing the end of sort of our predetermined questions, so I'm really keen to hear everyone else's thoughts and feedback and questions for both Ryan and myself. Ryan, before we jump into the audience questions, I'll kind of wrap up with a final part, building on that sort of question around resourcing and how much resourcing does it take. For a business that's looking at this, what would you recommend is their next best step? And what can they expect as a kind of resourcing or time that they'll need to put into sort of either A, reviewing themselves against the framework and the standard, or B, going for that certification?
Yeah, nice. And good pickup. I didn't answer your question. So thanks for re-asking it. Well, ideally, as least amount of time as possible, because with control number 1 being you helping the SMB, as in Ever Nimble and others helping the SMB, it should be pretty easy then to explain. Let's say the SMB's role is to understand that SMB 1001 is a good fit. Yeah. SMB 1001 certification is a good fit. Why? Because it addresses the first part of the decision-making process is I've got personal information and I must be compliant against the Australian privacy principles. Gold is really good for you. So that takes 30 seconds, literally on the cybercert.ai website. It's 30 seconds to determine what certification would be appropriate. So that's very small amount of time. It's not then the SMB's role to understand what is inside SMB 1001. It isn't. Because again, it's like giving them, I drive a Tesla. It's like giving me the Tesla manual to try and understand how I would fix my own Tesla. That ain't going to happen. Like it would take years for me to work that out. And meanwhile, I need to get to Coles, right? So it shouldn't take the SMB that long to understand what this means to them. But it really is to find the partner. And you can Google it right now. We'll have it on the partner marketplace shortly to say, hey, help me understand, is this fit for purpose? Now, of course, they have to sign a contract with the partner. That's the negotiation phase. That's the scoping discussions. However long that takes depends on how many people you need to meet with, whether you're already trusted advisor to them, all of that. That's a typical technology and partnership timeline. That is nothing to do with trying to understand or putting effort into understand what's in the standard. If you're a cybersecurity expert, do the training. It's free with PAX 8, or do the training with Ever Nimble if you are the cybersecurity expert that wants to understand what your role is in terms of then what's outsourced to Ever Nimble, what are we going to do ourselves? But really, that's a different discussion. That's a security expert trying to understand the standard, as opposed to the SMB who runs their business doesn't need to understand the standard.
Yeah, awesome. Look, I think that kind of wraps up sort of everything that I wanted to hear from you, Ryan. Unless there's anything from your end, we might open it up to the floor for some audience questions.
Yeah, let's get the Q&A. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, awesome. So we've got one question that's come in, is like, how can MSPs position SMB1001 as a value add to clients who may not yet prioritize cybersecurity or IT security in that space?
Well, man, that's a cyber risk education question, right? That's not necessarily a CyberCert or an SMB 1001, except that you can use everything from this conversation as in it's now fit for purpose, practical, proportionate, demonstrable to the people you care about with an internationally recognized cert at such an affordable entry point that we've taken all of the pain and the excuses away from the SMB to be able to protect their environment and the stuff that they care about and continue their operations. Now, you can take any of the insights that come from the data breach reports, from the ACSC and others, and we know that the average cost for a data breach to an SMB is 50 grand. Like that is
massive.
That'll break most SMBs, right? And so we also know that if you, again, use the CyberCert.ai selector tool on the website, if you care about personal information, then these are the types of things you need to have in place. The MSP has access to the toolkit, so you can do a quick gap analysis against the list that's in there, and you can show the SMB really quickly that you say 30% of them you aren't doing. And so you've got these vulnerabilities to the most common threats to your business. That's a workshop, right? Fundamentally, if it's not the SMB's priority, there is an awareness process that has to happen. That is actually just the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always the tough challenge, and again, it's something that I deal with definitely in my role all the time. Is that getting the clients or the team to understand the value of having good cybersecurity. And if I go back to your analogy around cybersecurity not having any intrinsic value until you wrap it around a really valuable asset and then make the board or the team or whoever you're trying to convince understand why and the possible risk that exists with not wrapping that cybersecurity ecosystem around that particular asset or the entire business, or however small or big that might be. That's a really important process, and it's not something that's new to anyone for sure. I feel like that's been a battle that all of us who have worked in the cybersecurity space have been dealing with at some level for a very long time.
Yeah, there's some common questions, and part of the CyberCert initiative is the ecosystem, so the partners and the community. And I had a question last week or whenever I was on the PAX 8 roadshow that sounded like you're still on your own. That ain't the case. Like as you go through, hey, how do others position this? Because you're just not going to get to serve 2 million SMBs as one MSP. So it's not like you're cutting each other's grass, right? It's to say that, how do you position it? And there's some fundamental questions, really. That's like, what would it mean if you lost your secret information? Yeah. What would it mean if you got breached and you weren't able to use your systems for 7 days?
Mm.
What would it mean if the personal information that you hold about your patients got breached? Healthcare practice. Yeah.
Mm.
And then sometimes it's like, yeah, actually, that doesn't matter so much. Well, that's a problem. But what else is on your laptop, sole trader, that you deal with? Well, I've got my
Yeah.
kids' photos on there and school reports. I'm like, what would it mean to you if that got breached? They're like, oh my God, we do not
Yeah.
want that because there's a lot of personal stuff on there, right? So now you make it personal to the
Mm.
decision maker, and now you know what that padlock means.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting stuff, especially when we wrap in both the ecosystem of personal life and professional
Yeah,
life. We often try to, well, I know I try to do my best at keeping those things separate on my device, but sometimes, the convenience of having it all in one place,
it is.
it just outweighs that cybersecurity question. And so
It
the thought of both of parts of my life being breached as a result of either of them having that sort of compromise is actually really frightening. And that's actually a really good point about sort of making it personal and bridging that gap for people who are thinking that way.
Nice.
Look, question from Chris. What tips would you give to an SMB owner to raise cyber awareness across their entire organization? So not just at the executive level and the board level, as we've kind of already discussed, but what do we think we can do to help, the new starters or even the subcontractors, like the third party risk and that side of things as well that we're bringing into our organizations? How do we help them raise their cyber awareness?
That's it. It's that question's been around for a long time, but let me attempt to give a tip. Right at the moment, SMB 1001 has cyber awareness training at Gold. Yeah, some of the feedback in the last 6 to 9 to 12 months has been, it's the human firewall. It's in some cases the first line of defense, and so there's discussion within the steering committee for DSI about what could it mean if it was brought forward. Now, you don't need to do full comprehensive for bronze for the flower shop owner. It just doesn't make sense, and we've got to keep that in mind, right? But here's the thing: in my enterprise experience, small business experience, it's absolutely starts with the leader. 100%, the leader has to lead by example.
Mm-hmm.
And that means the leader must understand what their responsibility and their role is in terms of managing cyber risk, not in any crazy understanding, but it's like we are a digital first business, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And if we get breached, that could be absolutely catastrophic to us or our delivery or whatever else. You staff are the front line. And so we want to introduce some of the basics and fundamentals so that if you actually get attacked, here's the things. It's kind of have this intuitive sense that if something smells fishy, it probably is. And then, of course, to have the right mechanisms in place to report it and whatever else. So you do need a little bit of technology to support the end users so that it's not just, walking through fire all the time. But the best tip is it's got to start with the leader.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that actually, because often what we see, or at least sometimes what I see when we're doing these sort of advisory and coming into organizations, is the leader is generally the person with the least amount of time, right? Because they've got a massive portfolio of work, they've got so much strategy and operations that they need to manage and see. So they're often the ones that don't want that extra MFA prompt on their phone, or they're often the ones that don't want to have to notify, their security team or whomever it might be that they're traveling next week because it's such a last minute trip. And look, we get that. Like that's a really important part. You need to be able to be flexible and you need to be able to be dynamic. But I think it's really important. And I think you've hit the nail on the head and we've kind of talked about it throughout the webinar already, is that it needs to start at that top level in the leaders of the business. So whether that's the board or the executive or whomever it might be.
Yeah.
And it needs to be a whole organization approach because you're right. Our employees and our team members are often our first and sometimes also our last line of defense. And unfortunately, as humans, we're pretty shocking when it comes to, cybersecurity, right? Rightly so. It's not something that we've necessarily all grown up with. We didn't go through school. You didn't learn necessarily how to do all this stuff or be cyber
You can't see it often.
No, and that's another problem in itself, right? This random threat that exists digitally and actually doesn't have any physical form. Sounds like, if we were back in the dark ages, we all would have been called witches,
Exactly.
and whatnot. And so it's really interesting to kind of bring that full circle and bring that all together. And we often say, and I know I say to clients when I'm talking to them that, we can put all the technical controls in place and all the processes in place as much as you want, but if someone doesn't follow the process, or someone, doesn't, or that technical control fails for some reason, or, someone plugs in a random USB or clicks on a phishing link, it's kind of all over. And it comes back to the person.
Yeah, and it really is role modeling, because it there might be the 10% of people who are like, well, what's that leader doing? I would never click on that. But the rest of them, really, you do is set the tone by the leader. It's like, well, the leader never reports it, so I don't care if you've done the training. It's like the training no longer means anything because the leader's ignoring the training that they've actually set for their own staff.
Yeah. And I think what's really important around that question around training, right, is as you kind of said, even if even if in the future SMB 1001 does bring that training from gold down to silver or bronze, and that requirement is it doesn't need to be a training packet. You don't need to go and sign up for some online training platform. Even coming to something like this, like coming to a webinar like this around cyber risk, that's still training. Like, we're not telling you don't click on a phishing link. We're not telling you, how to use your computer or how to be secure online. But you're still gaining an awareness of kind of what's going on within the cyberspace. It doesn't need to be overly complex, and it doesn't need to be this massive expenditure of money. You can find videos online on YouTube for free for small, medium business that, kind of cover off on that stuff.
Yeah, true. Well, actually, the cyber wardens training at the moment is government funded. So fully sponsored. So in that case, is it fully comprehensive and meet all your needs? It's not up to me to decide that, but you're right. There is stuff there. So,
and even asking the question, just being curious, right? We've got another question from Chanel, which is a really good one, around once we've aligned to SMB 1001 at any particular level. Do you have any tips, Ryan, to businesses around how to maintain that alignment with the constant change that happens, both in products and technology, but then also around legislation and government changes, and the way that we sort of have to comply with those higher level legislative requirements?
Nice. So DSI's job really is to understand what the SMB needs to work towards. Now, it's not a compliance mandate. It's actually an industry standard. It's not a government standard. It's not anything else. It's an independent industry standard, which means that it works internationally and across different legislative obligations and so on. Control number one is my answer. Okay, so it is not the idea for the SMB to try and understand what's in the standard and work out how to buy the next Microsoft thing, if that's the guess, because it will only always be a guess if it's like, well, my Tesla's showing a dash light thing that I need, and next thing I change the wheel and it's nothing to do with the wheel. It's a pretty cool new wheel, but it's like, dude, that wasn't even the problem. So lean on the experts, and it is my job to make sure that the experts are empowered to empower the SMBs. So if you're ever in doubt, ask your trusted partner.
Yeah. I think also a key one to add to that for me is, like, one of the first things when I was doing my cyber degree was one of the first things that you're taught is, in order to defend your environment, you need to know what's in your environment, i.e. you need that asset list. You need to know what's actually present. So you need to know that you've got that random, network device that's doing this thing, or these random CCTV cameras that are doing these things, and what that actually means and what that exposure is that they sort of represent within your environment. And so you're probably going to be able to tell me exactly what control number it is and exactly what level it comes in at. But I know SMB 1001 does heavily prioritize having that asset list and having that resource list and understanding of what's in the environment.
Yeah. So the answer to that is SMB 1000. So some of the other standards are scope based, right? So work out which of your assets process payment card information, and that's the stuff that's in scope of PCI. That obviously makes sense, because why would you try and protect credit card information on a system that doesn't have it? SMB 1001 is different in the sense that it applies everywhere unless you specifically say it's not applicable, right? So otherwise there's still the need to do the thinking about what's the risk, what's the controls I need, where do I need to put them, and so on. Now, as you go higher in the standard, which I can't tell you exactly what control it is, what number, but you could look it up real quick on the CyberCert website. But really only in the higher levels where you have an independent verification are you obliged to show that you have a digital asset register. And that actually means, do you want me to check? I'm going to check live. Hang on, there's a question there to check live. Let's have a look. Whoever can browse to the CyberCert website, if you can beat me to it.
Surely you have it booked. Surely it just opens when you open your browser, right? Like, isn't it just the home
It is. It's right here. It's right here. Yeah, and it literally takes 20 seconds. But I closed down all of my browsers so that I didn't get interrupted. I'm pretty sure it's in Diamond. Diamond has, where are we? Yes, good. Very good. So we have control number 22 in the list. Now, as you read the standard, I'm not going to get too technical. It's from gold that you must have implement and maintain a digital asset register. But as you go through platinum and diamond, it increases in terms of what you need to have in that and how comprehensive it is, right? That's the maturity type approach to SMB 1001. For bronze and silver, it's kind of assumed that you don't have that many assets that you need to protect, right? If you do, then you're probably looking at gold, platinum, and diamond, right? Do you have a big online presence? What are your web assets? What are your endpoint assets? What are your server assets, and so on? Now, when it gets more comprehensive than that, when your team gets too big, and this is kind of a constant maintenance thing, when your organization gets too big and you've got to have governance and risk management, you're actually now talking about ISO.
Yeah.
SMB 1001 has a limit. It's not designed for the enterprise.
Yeah, but it's designed as being that sort of stepping stone and scaffold towards ISO, right? Like it's not like it's completely separate. I think that's a really key point that we kind of necessarily haven't talked on, is sort of as that, let's say you've got a small medium business that is growing towards that enterprise level. Yeah. Like this is the framework that can scale with you as you grow.
Yes, it is. And, some SMBs will never get to that point and never need it, but others might be growing significantly, and therefore they have an obligation to their enterprise clients to also maintain ISO. You can have a couple of strings to your bow in that sense, but really, if the organization isn't big enough to warrant that, that's where SMB 1001 comes in.
Yeah, awesome. Look, I think we have time for one more question. This one comes in from Ellis. How can SMB 1001 help small, medium businesses in picking an IT provider? So often we see, a lot of varying advice around cyber frameworks, specifically when we're going out to clients who perhaps are looking for a new provider in IT. And so how does SMB 1001 help when those businesses are looking for an IT provider?
When SMBs are looking for an IT provider and they're asking specifically for standards, did I get that?
Oh yeah, like let's say they're going out to an IT provider and they've got one organization that's talking about Essential 8, one organization talking about, like they're not, obviously we've talked about the fact that they're not comparison and apples for apples, right? So what should businesses kind of be looking out for when they're looking at IT providers, and what sort of frameworks are being pitched to them?
Yeah, so let's take defense and even financial services, right? Defense has DISP, DISP, and this will not replace that, because the defense industry and the people that serve defense are obliged to have a DISP accreditation. So I can't tell you, oh no, it's not fit for purpose, even though in some cases it fundamentally is not fit for purpose. It doesn't matter, because CyberCert Diamond is not recognized by the defense industry to say, yes, we accept that you've done that. Will that evolve over time? Maybe, for sure. But again, it's not intended to replace and displace some of the other standards that are out there. Financial services, APRA regulations, and some others, of course, it is not intended to stop that either, right? SOCI, let me talk about SOCI. SOCI doesn't specifically say what to do, right? It just says you need to do stuff. Yeah. You need to have supply chain, for example. Does SMB 1001 work for the supply chain in some of the SOCI regulated? Yes, it does. It does. It doesn't replace ISO for the higher risk ones that need an actual governance, risk management, compliance framework. But yes, SMB 1001 fits into that. So the real short answer is you have to understand what your obligations are.
Mm.
And where it's not clear, or there really isn't a particular regulatory obligation that you have, then SMB 1001 is that. It's the sand around the other big rocks that are mandated.
Mm. Yeah, awesome.
So have a couple of strings to the bow. That's what I can say. As an MSP, like, you will be asked about SMB 1001, and there will be 80% of the SMBs that aren't obligated to comply with some of the other enterprise grade frameworks.
Yeah, I think what's really important in that question, and in the question of anything to do with cyber and IT, right? And this is probably the part that I get so frustrated about, is your context is really important.
Yes.
There is no point trying to shove ISO 27001 or NIST or anything down the throat of someone who is a 5-person small medium business. It does not make sense, and it is not context specific. The same way that it doesn't make sense for us to go and spend tens of thousands of dollars on, fantastic whiz-bang technology that's great for enterprise, but has no business being in place in someone's, home office for, their 2-person business, right? So context is really important when we're kind of having those discussions with clients around even things like the threat landscape. Like we've talked a little bit about it. Like, the things that are targeting massive enterprises is not what's targeting small, medium business. It's not the same thing. And so that's really important when you're kind of having those discussions around the cybersecurity protections you're putting in place, but then also the frameworks or even the sort of best practice that you're aligning to. That's really where that context comes in and is really important.
Nice. Yeah, you nailed that. I did see a question. Maybe is it on the conformity assessment body? Was there a question on that?
Yeah, Michael's asked a quick question, and I'm very conscious of time because we have gone past the 12 o'clock mark. But we'll keep the recording going. Can you explain more about the DSI approved conformity assessment body?
Yeah.
Presume we're talking about the platinum and diamond,
not quite. Okay. So it is a really good question. So thanks for asking it and recording it. So Dynamic Standards International is the standards body, like ISO. Yeah, it's the body that defines and continually updates the standard. CyberCert is the conformity assessment body, which is actually properly termed the Dynamic Standards Certifier. It's the issuer of certificates once the organization has demonstrated that it's met the obligations of that. Scaled in a way for small businesses so that up to gold, it is self-attested with the help, of course, of the certified partner to ensure that gold has been implemented. For platinum and diamond, that's an IVO, an independent verification organization that CyberCert contracts to perform the external audit against the 3402 audit methodology and others to make sure that BSI is one of them, British Standards International, is one of our IVOs that is consulted to bring in the auditors to make sure that platinum and diamond have been addressed, which therefore gives the standard and the certification credibility for enterprises seeking to say, well, if you need to respond to my service request within 8 hours, then you need to have some pretty advanced controls in place, still fit for purpose for an SMB. So DSI standards body, CyberCert's the certification body, independent verification organizations are contracted by CyberCert before CyberCert then issues the certification for platinum and diamond.
Yeah, awesome. That's some really good clarity in that separation between the two. Awesome. Look, I am very conscious of time, but the one question that has come in is actually something I'm also a little bit curious about. And it's a very picky one, but I'm really glad that Glenn sent this through. Look, SMB 1001, specifically Control 7, Glenn's gone and done his research. It refers to routine password changes, but modern guidance that we're seeing from, NIST, ISO, the ACSC, others now are saying that we want to go with strong passwords or passphrases that we're not changing on a regular basis because it encourages that sort of, let's just change the number at the end of my password and, we'll continue moving on. Is SMB planning on revising that control, or how would you advise organizations to implement that or, comply with that, given that most of us now are sticking with your password doesn't expire, provided you're providing a strong one?
Nice. So I do not provide advice.
Yeah.
Okay. CyberCert will not provide advice. It's up to the MSP to ensure that the control intent and the objective has been met to meet the risk.
Awesome.
Having said that, it is a very common one, and it is going through the process at the moment for clarity. And this is exactly the example of when controls seem to become outdated, but it doesn't negate it, because there's lots of businesses that don't have the more advanced password and authentication mechanisms in place. But here's what you contact, and I can send this to you after: registrar@dsi.org, because it's a DSI question, not a CyberCert question. That is where you get the official response from DSI that can answer your questions. Okay, so instead of making assumptions, but some people do, instead of making assumptions, if you really want the clarity and get the formal response, then ask DSI, and you'll get a little bit of extra guidance there, without, of course, suggesting what the particular solution is to address the control. And then talk to the community as well. Talk to the CyberCert community. How are they meeting that? How are they confidently meeting the risk management intent of the control objective? If it's way more advanced, then it might be an opportunity to say we've met the control objective and we're very comfortable that that cannot be breached.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of the key part. And I know you said you don't provide advice, but what you went to afterwards around, does what you have in place meet the intent of the control, is actually kind of the key part for me. So, you know, for me, that when that control came out and when we started looking at it, it was or raising that awareness for all the things we don't change routinely, right? So what about like that printer that you've just purchased, and, you know, you've just purchased that brand new printer. Have you changed that default password, and are you sort of tracking and perhaps changing that maybe once or twice every 1 or 2 years? So it's those sorts of passwords that I think are a really good part of that control. Not just the passwords that sit behind our email identities or whatever it might be that we're using on a day-to-day basis, but all those other things that are in our environment too. Yeah,
and again, officially, will the standard be adjusted? That's a DSI question. It has to go through the steering committee. Are all of the experts on the panel hearing the same thing? At which case it then goes to the recommendation to update that, whatever that might be, provide guidance around it. It might be that the control, the description's not necessarily updated, but additional guidance is given in terms of how you can meet the intent of that. So take that not as advice, but if you want the official response, as registrar@dsi.org.
Yeah. Awesome. Look, thank you, Ryan, so much for your time, and thank you everyone who has jumped on and joined us. It's been a pleasure hosting you, Ryan, and seeing the insights and well, not the advice, but the expertise that you've provided behind small medium business for both the SMB1001 framework, but then also how those enterprise controls are being adjusted and brought down to hopefully have a framework that's continuously updated and modern for our small medium business, and puts them at the forefront of it rather than being the second thought.
Amazing.
Look, for those of you who are still on the call, we are going to cut and upload the recording, and so that will come out via email in the next day or two, so keep an eye out for that. But of course, as always, if you have any questions or want any advice around SMB 1001 or how to secure your small medium business, please reach out to Evan Imber. We're more than happy to jump on a call and have a discussion with you, of course. But for now, stay secure as much as you possibly can, and keep an eye on our social media for any updates and any future webinars. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.